All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much to all of you for joining today's webinar around greening industry sustainable solutions for manufacturing businesses in New York City. This is a Made in NYC webinar. My name is Joanna Reynolds, and I am the manager of program and partnership development for Made in NYC. For those of you who are new to Made in NYC is a nonprofit initiative that is part of the Pratt Center for Community Development that supports thousands of New York City's manufacturers and makers to help them increase and improve their marketing and branding capacity and serve as just a general support for all of New York City's manufacturing community. Today, we're really excited to have a conversation around greening the manufacturing industry, and specifically, we're going to be talking about Local Law 97. I am now going to turn it over to our moderator, Rebecca Morris, who's a senior program manager for the Pratt Center for Community Development, and she will continue to open it up and then introduce our panelists. So Rebecca, throwing it to you.
Hey, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Thanks for your patience. As Joanna mentioned, we're still learning the Zoom thing, and so have some patience with me as well as I'm doing a couple things on here. This is my first time moderating on Zoom. Hope everyone's doing well. I am going to do a brief introduction to why we are holding this panel today. I'm going to provide brief intros to our panelists and an overview of the agenda, and then I'm going to hand it off to our panelists, who I think you will find super helpful and interesting and really knowledgeable about how we can all green our businesses and meet the requirements of Local Law 97. Oh, you cannot see saying you can't see my video. Okay, let's see. There we go. Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. Okay. So when Local Law 97 was passed, as excited as I was for this landmark legislation, I was immediately concerned about the impacts on manufacturing businesses, because although I no longer work directly with the sector, I had for many years with Pratt Center worked with industrial manufacturing businesses. I still hold it near and dear, as is Pratt Center, and of course, Made in NYC. We know New York City's manufacturers face numerous business pressures, and we also know that climate change is a very real threat to business and the city as a whole. So it's vital to figure out how to both reduce carbon emissions across all sectors of New York City's economy and building stock, which, by the way, about 70% of New York City's emissions come from buildings, but also to ensure that businesses are able to meet the requirements as the law goes into effect over the next couple of years in a sustainable manner that doesn't further strain them. So today we look forward to beginning this conversation with a great group of panelists. We have, in order of who will be speaking, we have Elissa Knight from the New York City Mayor's Office of Sustainability. Elissa is a policy advisor on the Strategic Initiatives team at the Mayor's Office of Sustainability and supports the development and implementation of the New York City Accelerator, with particular focus on buildings larger than 25,000 square feet and affordable housing. She received her Master of Science in Sustainability from Columbia. Next, we will have Fatou Jabi from USL Technology. She is a lead accredited professional in new building design and construction and founder of USL Tech, a New York City-based sustainability and energy efficiency consultancy firm. She has over 15 years of experience working in the private sector, energy efficiency consulting with industrial and commercial businesses, specializing in a multitude of areas, including energy simulation modeling, smart energy management, New York City sustainability, carbon emission limits and local law compliance, and improving air quality for occupant and tenant health and well-being. Lastly, we will hear from Brian Coleman, who is the CEO of the Greenpoint Manufacturing and Design Center. Brian has served as CEO and to GMDC and its related companies since 2003, where he oversees the organization's building portfolio, organizational operations, and real estate development. He has over 30 years of experience in economic development, commercial, industrial, and residential development, and property management in New York City and New Jersey. Brian also served as the chief executive of a business improvement district and has held positions with the Jersey City Economic Development Corporation and the Brooklyn Economic Development Corporation. This afternoon, Alyssa will kick us off with an overview of Local Law 97, what it is, how it works, and how it fits into the city's ongoing journey of making New York City a leader in fighting climate change. Fatu will then examine how Local Law 97 relates to industrial businesses and how industrial manufacturing businesses can integrate energy efficiency into their operations and what resources are out there to help. And then Brian will provide insights on his experience with energy efficiency and the work GMDC has done to integrate energy efficiency and clean energy into their operations in order to give you a sort of a case study, a better sense of what you may expect when your buildings begin the journey of meeting the Local Law 97 requirements. And then we'll round it out with a question and answer. I encourage you to ask questions throughout the chat, through the chat as they arise, and we will work through answering them during the Q&A. And just like one last friendly note, this stuff is complex, so don't feel weird if something seems like it should be obvious and it isn't. Ask questions. We want everyone to walk away feeling a bit more comfortable on this subject. And then also a quick note, I will be letting each panelist know about when there's a minute left in their presentation time period so we can stick with our time frame. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alyssa, and it looks like I think I now need to share my screen. Give me 1 second. Okay, so Alyssa, just let me know when you want me to move ahead. I think that makes the most
Sounds good.
sense.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. As Rebecca mentioned, my name is Alyssa Knight, and I'm a policy advisor working in the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. Thanks for having me today. We can go on to the next slide.
Okay, and does this look okay, or does it need to be bigger?
If you can do a full screen, it might be helpful for some of the later slides that I have with graphs.
There we go.
Perfect. So today I'd like to start by providing an overview of One NYC and the city's sustainability goals, then discuss a brief history of building legislation and give an overview of the Climate Mobilization Act. I'll also focus on Local Law 97 for today's conversation, and then I'll finish by discussing some New York City programs and resources that you can look to. Next slide, please. So One NYC 2050 published last year detailed the city's strategy to confront our climate crisis and achieve equity. It has 8 chapters, but the one most relevant to this conversation is, of course, the Livable Climate chapter. Next slide, please. So the Livable Climate chapter really demonstrated our commitment to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, which was a stated goal that we published in One NYC 2050, and that will require a radical shift to transform the city's buildings, energy, transportation, and waste sectors to fully electrify the city. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, I wanted to show a brief history of how far we've come and how this has led us to where we are today. So over the past 10 years, we've passed a number of local laws pertaining to buildings to better the monitoring and collection of data, which is evident from the Greener, Greater Buildings Plan local laws, and also strengthen the standards, which Local Law 32 is an example of. And most recently, we passed the Climate Mobilization Act last year, or CMA for short, which consists of a suite of several local laws, which is next slide, and then I'll provide a brief description of each of them. So some of the local laws in the CMA include Local Law 92 and 94, which require that new buildings or major renovations be covered in green roofs or solar panels on all available space on their roofs. Local Law 95, which is an amendment to another Local Law 33, there's so many different numbers, which will require buildings to post energy efficiency grades in their buildings starting in a few weeks, actually, this fall. Local Law 96, which established a sustainable energy loan program known as PACE financing. And under PACE, the loan stays with the building rather than the owner. Therefore, when a building is sold, the owner wouldn't have to worry about making payments, which makes it easier for owners to work and benefit from energy savings. And finally, which is the focus of today, is Local 97, and I'll go into more detail on later slides, but that requires existing buildings over 25,000 square feet in New York City to meet strict greenhouse gas emissions limits starting in 2024 and becoming more stringent over time. Next slide, please. So in New York City, we know that over 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from buildings. So the CMA is really important because by 2030, we expect that the CMA will reduce carbon emissions by 6 million tons, create over 26,000 jobs, avoid hospitalizations, and prevent death, multiple deaths per year. So that's really important. Next slide, please. So now moving on to discuss Local 97, as mentioned previously, it's applicable to buildings over 25,000 square feet. Next slide. Based on a building's occupancy class, the building will need to have a registered architect or engineer to calculate the building's greenhouse gas budget. So in the law, each building occupancy class has a strict limit, and then you multiply that by the square footage of the property to obtain your budget. And if a building exceeds that budget, they will be subject to a penalty of $268 per metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent in excess of the budget. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide shows an example of how a building's greenhouse gas budget would be calculated for 2030. So in this example, you would calculate your building's budget. So this building has a budget of 935 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, but as you can see, the actual emissions exceeded that. So you would take the excess and multiply that by the 268 to assess the penalty that building would face for the 2030 reporting year. Next slide, please. So this graph is an example of how buildings are performing today, with the worst performing on the left and the best on the right in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And additionally, from this graph, you can tell that a majority of buildings are below the 2024 target, but then you can see as you know, the target gets more stringent over time. So then more buildings will have to do more work in order to meet their limits for each reporting year or cycle. Next slide. Thank you. So in order to assist buildings and provide building decision makers with the support that they need to meet New York City's ambitious climate goals, we will be launching the New York City Accelerator, which builds off the experience of the Retrofit Accelerator, if many of you are familiar with that program, and also the Community Retrofit program. And the New York City Accelerator is a free technical assistance program to help buildings complete energy efficiency measures, to improve their property condition, to really help you understand where to start and how you can, if you have to comply with Local 97, how you can achieve what you need to do in order to meet the goals. And also we will connect or help you connect with incentive resources that are offered by utilities, offer trainings for building staff, owners, contractors, and help with promoting some best practices and clean energy technologies. Next slide, please. Also, we have a number of resources that are available at the Building Energy Exchange website. So I think the slides will be shared, there's a link in there that you can go to where you can see different participant profiles of buildings that were involved in the New York City Retrofit Accelerator, which high performance track, which helped buildings implement 10 to 15-year capital plans to reduce buildings significantly by 40 to 60%. And also on their website, you can find events and trainings on a variety of different topics. So that can be a really good resource for understanding different technologies and also seeing some case studies and how they've worked in buildings. And I think I just have one more slide. Next one. Also, I wanted to share this resource. This is a screenshot of another resource that we have available for buildings that have reported to Local Law 84. So if you have buildings over 25,000 square feet that have complied with Local Law 84, there is a website that you can go to, and the link should be on this as well, that you can see how your building is performing today and measure against future targets. So it's just another resource that can be helpful to assess where your building is today. And I think that's all I have, right? Okay.
Okay, thank you. I see that someone has raised their hands. Now we're going to try and get to all the questions at the end, but we encourage you to just ask them now, so we sort of have them listed out. But Fatu's going to go now, and I guess Fatu, I can share your Prezi unless you can share it from your screen.
I can do that from my screen too.
Okay, it might be a little bit easier.
Yeah, okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for doing such an excellent introduction of my company. And Alyssa, thank you also for addressing what the Mayor's Office of Sustainability is doing, because we all live in the city of New York and the state of New York City, but also the state of New York, and they're all interrelated. So my company is USL Technology. I'm a consultant, and I work on partially I work on a program that is being offered by the Mayor's Office of Sustainability, but I also work on incentive programs that is being offered by Con Edison. As we all know, in the 5 boroughs, Con Edison, we all pay our Con Edison bills to, whether you're a residential building or a commercial building, we all pay our utility bills to Con Ed around electricity, natural gas, or steam. And my background is in software and systems engineering, and it's quite fascinating because as much as we need to really initially have to focus on policies and local laws, which is local laws that Alyssa has elaborated on. But at the end of the day, going down the line, we're going to be looking at smarter technologies that allows us to see how efficiently or inefficiently we are actually using energy in our buildings. And technology allows you to do that. And my company kind of focuses in that area. But we also very much focus on local laws, because these are policies and laws that are built by the city and the state. And the utility provides incentives because it enables commercial landlords and commercial tenants to offset some of their cost from implementing these solutions. The Climate Mobilization Act is focused on 5 laws, and prior to the climate mobilization was the Greener Greater Buildings Plan, which was from 2009. And I've been following for the past decade all of our New York City energy efficiency laws. But as Alyssa has elaborated, with the climate mobilization laws, we have Local Law 92, which I have up on the very top of the screen. And then we have Local Law 92, basically focused on green roofs. And by the way, if you have any questions on anything I have here, reach out to Rebecca or Joanna or Taylor, and I'll be very, very happy to have a subsequent meeting with you to share a little bit more information on them. And then we have Local Law 94, which is focused on integrating solar into your buildings. And we're talking about manufacturing buildings. And there's a huge physical footprint on some of these properties that could implement solar. So just kind of keep that in mind. Climate Mobilization Act, which went into effect of April of last year in 2019, you have Local Law 95, which is basically grading your building as a landlord, how efficient your building is in terms of using energy and water, right? So it's called the Building Energy Efficiency Grading. If you recall our restaurant gradings, you go to a restaurant and it has a grading of A or B, you kind of have to decide if you want to go into this restaurant because it's being graded based on its health code compliance. Going forward, buildings are going to have something similar that is based on how efficiently they use energy and water. And Local Law 96 is basically allowing owners to find ways to fund and finance their energy efficiency project. That program is still being worked out in terms of what are the different components as to how what resources are going to be available from NYC, how to fund your energy efficiency project. But the law that governs that is Local Law 96. Now we're talking about the big kahuna in the house, which is Local Law 97, which is the biggest and boldest law, quite frankly, we say in the industry across the country, because now we're talking about the environmental impacts of carbon emission in our atmosphere. And Local Law 97 is the biggest and boldest that we have seen in the city in the past year, and New York City has enacted that, and that's the point of our conversation today. And I'll dig into it a little bit going forward in terms of how that impacts the manufacturing and manufacturing and industrial sector. Now, what is Local Law 97? So it is assessed based on the carbon emission budget. Just a second, let me just kind of minimize this thing on my side. Okay, so it's based on the carbon emission budget, based on the occupancy classification of spaces within a property. So you can have a mixed-use building. A mixed-use building means you may have a residential building that may have a restaurant and a supermarket, or you may have a hotel that may have a bar and a restaurant in it. And the space use classification depends because every space uses energy differently. If you're a restaurant, you use energy differently. If you're a manufacturing business, you use energy differently. If you're a residential building, you use energy differently. So your carbon emission is calculated based on your energy use pattern. And I think it's equally fair that if you are a heavy energy use consumer, like supermarkets, because they need to cool a lot of the food products that we buy all the time, or if you're a data center, which is my background, where data centers are running 24/7 year-round, processing all of our data that we consume from LinkedIn, Facebook, Amazon, whatever you have, the local law kind of attributes your energy consumption and your compliance requirement based on those types of use patterns. Now, as a professional in the industry, we have to work with architects and New York State registered architects, but New York State registered engineers to actually stand behind what we say a building's carbon emission budget is, so that the Department of Buildings in New York City can actually start looking at whether you are within your carbon emission limit, your carbon emission budget, or if you're going over the budget that has been ascribed. And I will go into it a little bit more. So if you exceed your carbon emission, as Alyssa has also shared earlier, the fine and the penalty is pretty clear. So for every single metric ton per CO2 that you go over, you're going to be charged as a building owner $268 per metric ton of CO2. Okay, so generally in New York City, we are a very densely populated environment, right? And currently we have about 51.7 million metric tons of CO2. And that's a combination of steam, which is about 2% of how much that contributes to the emissions that we have, And 40% of that emission comes from fossil fuels and from our buildings. And then about 30% comes from our transportation sector, and about 3% of that comes from our building sector. Now, and we're talking about numbers from 2016. We're in 2019, this law is going to go into effect in 2024. But by 2050, once the law goes into effect, if you can see on the arrow that's going down, we're going to be reducing our millions of metric tons of CO2 from 51.7 up top here to 11.8 million metric tons of CO2 by 2050. And I'll share with you what we need to do as an industry and as businesses and as consultants, the different technologies and the different initiatives we would have to install to get to that 11.8 million metric tons of CO2. So innovative and forward-thinking solutions, right? I have lighting upgrades and controls. We all know about the, the lighting retrofit upgrades, going from installing LED lightings, and we're talking about submetering, installing controls, and building automation systems. But generally, these are technologies that most landlords don't necessarily take on by themselves to install right away. So, and some of them can be quite cost prohibitive, but we have to go through a consultation process with landlords and tenants. And the tenants in this case, you kind of have to keep this in mind. If you are a manufacturing business, you are a tenant in a commercial building. So you have to work with your landlord to start having this conversation about Local Law 97. Now, by law, Local Law 97 requires that buildings with emissions that are higher than what they are prescribed will have to make sure that they install energy conservation measures to make sure that they are addressing the emissions that they have gone above. Now, these energy conservation measures include upgrading your lighting to comply with standards from systems that are set forth within the New York City Energy Conservation Code. Now, Local Law 85 was enacted from 2009. Now, we're talking about the Climate Mobilization Act and Local Law 97, which came into effect last year, April of 2019. So these laws kind of piggyback off of each other. So it's really, really important when you work with consultants and your property management firm or your landlord to kind of really understand when you sign your lease as a tenant, what these mean to you as a tenant in these spaces. And one of the things that Local Law 97 requires you to do is to, insulate your pipes for heating and cooling. Again, this depends on the landlord because most tenants don't have to do this. And I'm just sharing it to kind of just show you, even though it's dependent on the landlord, I mean, tenants are the ones that use energy. So just kind of keep that in mind because we are all in this together. Installing timers on your exhaust fans, weatherizing and air sealing, adjusting temperatures. These are actually prescribed by Local Law 97 as to what landlords need to do. Subsequently, you're installing individual temperature controls, installing indoor and outdoor heating systems, installing or upgrading your steam system, and master venting at the ends of mains, large horizontal paths and top of risers, or vertical pipes, or even branching off main pipe systems. So this, I want to kind of give you an example of how these targets are being determined. So building typologies, depending on your buildings. I have here highlighted hotels and dormitories because my company works with hotels. My company USL.
So we have 1 minute left.
Okay,
Sorry.
That's okay. So depending on your building type, if you are an industrial building, your building type is also going to determine how much energy and what the target that you need to make, right? So you have your 2020 targets, and you have your 2030 targets, and you have your 2050 targets. So if you're a mixed use building, right, and you're 30,000 square foot, that is a ground retail store, and you are 200,000 square foot, and a little bit or over of a residential retail store in the same building, by the way, your GHG emissions limit is calculated based on your space use type, residential and retail. And then that tells you how much metric tons of CO2 that you're going to be over as a building, right? Combined with residential and retail. And then based on that, which Alyssa has specified, even though the landlord is responsible for it, the tenants are the ones that use most of this energy. The landlord almost just leases its space to the tenants, right? So in terms of calculating the penalties, if you're a mixed-use building and the penalties are calculated and you're over, if you're over 1,162 metric tons of CO2, because of your building type, you were supposed to have 932 metric tons of CO2. At the end of the year, you are going to have to pay $185,000 and $724 in terms of fines, which local law 87, that's been around for the past 10 years, only charge you like $5,000. So local law 97 has really kind of pushed the challenge to a point where landlords and tenants cannot really afford to not pay attention to energy or water use challenges within their buildings, right? So I'm gonna pass through the compliance. I wanted to just quickly touch on what resources do you have? Green leases. If you are a tenant and you're going to be leasing a space in a residential, in a commercial building, you really want to start talking about, you know, energy use, or how do you pay your utility to the landlord, right? And then the landlord is responsible for compliance when it comes to local law 97. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the tenant is not responsible as well. And when the fines get initiated by Department of Buildings, it may get passed through to the tenant. And this is the very reason why tenants and landlords need to build that communication between them. So subsequently, oh, hold on. I'm literally, it almost looks like I'm going backwards. Hold on just a second.
And I'd just like to make the point that we know this is really complicated stuff, right? Like you're probably looking at like all these calculations and thinking like, how am I going to do that, right? One of the reasons the Retrofit Accelerator, excuse me, now it's now the New York City Accelerator exists, is to have advisors for free that can support you in figuring this stuff out, because we do know it's very complicated. If it's okay, Fatou, do you have anything else right now? I'd like to pass it to Brian just for time, because I know.
Go ahead and pass it to Brian, but I do agree with what you say. I mean, I'm a consultant on the Retrofit Accelerator program, and I think one of the intents as part of this conversation is to put it out there that both tenants and landlords are not necessarily on their own. There are resources that's available from the City of New York and the Mayor's Office of Sustainability, but also from Con Edison and NYC to help them from a financial perspective, but also from a compliance perspective, to start figuring out how to move forward from here. So, so let's talk to Brian, and then we'll open it up to conversations from the attendees.
Thank you, Fatou. And yes, Brian's now going to talk about his experience with GMDC and energy efficiency, and obviously local law 97 he hasn't had to come into compliance with yet. But Brian, if you could just tell us your story.
Thank you.
Tell us our story. Sure, I'm happy to. I hope I have all my settings. Yes, I'm on, and I have my video. We have been dealing with this issue for a long time, and I guess one of the questions asked of me is why do we want to implement these things? Way back when I first came to GMDC back in 2002, 2003, because we wanted to experiment, because it was new technology and we knew it was good for the environment. So our first solar arrays at our Manhattan Avenue and Humboldt Street buildings at the time, back in 2003, were the largest commercial solar arrays of their kind in the city of New York. Obviously, they're no longer large in comparison to some very, very large, which are great systems that have been installed in recent years. So we initially did this out of the goodness of our heart, so to speak. It was something that we received some subsidy for. I think our first project was about $1.6 million. A third of it was paid by GMDC, a third was paid by Con Ed, and a third was paid by a settlement with Clean Air Communities. So there was also obviously some financial incentive for us to start putting our big toe in the water and seeing, you know, how the world was changing when it came to energy and energy efficiency. But it's interesting, you know, fast forward to today, we do it for a variety of reasons. We do it because of all these local laws that we've just talked about, that some people could debate whether they're all good. Some are more problematic than others. But we also do it, believe it or not, for financing purposes. The world has changed, and big banks now require us to have reach a certain level of energy efficiency when we do a new building. Our last two projects, Bank of America and Citibank, both required that we have some sort of energy rating on our new projects. We happen to choose the LEED certification over Energy Star, and there's 2 or 3 others, I forget their names. But now it's required of us both locally through the government, and it's required through us through our finances. And so it's becoming more of something that we have to pay attention to every day. And I think that's very good for the environment. I think it's good for our tenants. It's just complicated, as you just said. It's something that we're going to have to adapt to. Local 92, 94, 95, 97. These are not things that they're easily tracked by lay people who currently haven't immersed themselves. What are the pros and cons? There are many more pros and cons. The cons really are financial, that some of these things could be very expensive to do. I will tell you that, just to go back to LEED for a second, industrial buildings are a little bit of a square peg in a round hole when it comes to something like LEED. GMDC generally takes, or always takes, old industrial buildings, usually single user industrial buildings, and we renovate them, do gut renovations, and make them multi-tenanted, multi-user industrial buildings. Well, guess what? LEED doesn't have a category for that. We're a bit of a square peg in a round hole. LEED would give us credit for high efficiency energy, air conditioning systems. We don't have air conditioners, so we don't get, you would think that we would get double the credit if you didn't have air conditioning systems. LEED would give us credit for having bamboo floors instead of oak floors. Well, we don't put either in. We just use the plain concrete that's there, but we don't get credit for that. So this sector, I can't speak to commercial, I can't speak to residential, I can't speak to retail, but the industrial sector, at least as it stands in older industrial cities. I'm not talking about GM building a new plant in Detroit, or Toyota building a new plant in South Carolina. But when you're talking about old industrial stock, and probably the industrial stock in the city is 95% old, there's not a lot new. It's difficult to do a lot of the things that are being asked of us because the buildings, again, are a bit of a square peg in a round hole. But we do it, and we enjoy doing it. Our tenants do it. I mean, just as an aside, our tenants in the 17 or so years that I'm here have gotten much younger and smarter and more kind of appreciative of the world around them. So they are not opposed to, and actually look forward to, the idea of us upgrading our buildings. Obviously, there are going to be costs associated with that, and some of those costs are going to be borne by the tenants, but they're intelligent. They understand the world that we live in. They understand that we couldn't continue on the path that we're on, and that they acknowledge that the improvements of energy improvements to the buildings in which they occupy are good for us. It's good for them. And some of them are actually starting to use it to market it. I mean, where we have solar arrays, and we have them on all of our buildings except one, some of our tenants actually say that their product is produced with clean, green energy. So it's interesting how different people, that's more of people who sell to a more retail setting than in a commercial or industrial setting. But we do have people that are doing it. We have a jeweler that's done it. And we also have a we have a furniture maker that continues to do it. The incentives, there are some out there. There aren't as many as we would like. One of the things that we've kind of switched gears on, I've talked about really the financing mechanisms have changed. In the early project, I mentioned, you know, we spent about $500,000-$600,000 of our own money. We don't do that anymore. We don't spend a dime on solar, for example. We do what are called power purchase agreements. So we contract with a solar provider. We're just so happy that we have a leading solar provider who's one of our tenants, a company called Solar Energy Systems. And what happens is the energy provider, the solar provider comes in, puts the solar array in, whether it's a small system or 35 kW or a larger system, 80 kW, and they pay for it in its entirety. And what we do is contract with them for a period of generally 25 or 30 years, and we agree to buy energy from them at a fixed cost at somewhere about 14, 15 cents a kilowatt. We probably paid close to 30 cents a kilowatt at Con Ed this summer, but we're paying 14 cents a kilowatt from our solar energy providers. So it's a great way for us to improve the energy efficiency of the building, reduce the load on the system, which is really important to some place like Con Ed, and then allow our tenants to produce their products with green energy. We're really keen on the PPAs, as they're called, power purchase agreements, and I'm hopeful that local law 94, outside of GMDC's interest, will encourage other people to do it, and that the phenomenon of a PPA is something that becomes more common, because it will be much easier for property owners to install solar if they use this financing mechanism, as opposed to going the old-fashioned way and just paying for it out of their own pocket. Let's see, advice for landlords. I think, well, one is follow the PPA route. I think one of the things that I've been sitting here thinking about as we've listened to some of the speakers, that we haven't done it yet, but we're going to have to start to change our leases, and we're going to have to start to structure our leases so that the tenants' responsibilities are more clearly outlined than they have been in the past. So that's something that I think landlords could look at closely. It's, again, this is a new phenomenon, and it's come upon us quickly. And local law 97 is really going to just force us to do that, because though we have many bright-eyed and bushy-tailed tenants who want to do these things, some tenants won't be so enlightened and be reluctant to do it. And when it comes to sharing the cost of some of the improvements that will be required of us, or their improvements, because they're going to have more energy efficient equipment, more energy efficient lighting, more energy efficient motors and whatnot, the cost of that is going to have to be clearly defined on who does what and what the ratios are and what the proportions are. So I don't know if that's going to be problematic. It's probably something that just needs to be clarified so that all the parties from the get-go, when you sign a new lease or renew a lease, understands what their responsibilities are. And I think that's probably a little bit of a moving target, because we have to see how this evolves, how the buildings come back, the ratings, so on and so forth. In terms of,
we're about at 1 minute. Sorry, Brian. Before.
Okay, sure. The specifics of GMDC is that our buildings are rather simple. As I said earlier, we don't have air conditioning. We don't have fancy finishes. Our heating systems are, I don't want to say rudimentary, but they're simple and efficient. So that, but some buildings are not. And some buildings, and particularly in industrial buildings, there are a lot of old kind of rundown industrial buildings that haven't seen a lot of capital improvements in a long time. And I think there may have to be programs developed on the city side or possibly the state side to give people some additional financial incentive to make the improvements. Because as you can see from the calculations that Fatou showed us just a few moments ago, some of the penalties are going to be pretty stiff. And so people are really going to have to figure out what the penalties are and what the price is going to be to fix those issues that need to be fixed to avoid those penalties, because we're not talking about the $5,000 penalty that we may have had a few years ago. We're talking about, in some cases, 6 figures, and that could be daunting.
Definitely. definitely. It's big numbers, and that's really why we wanted to get businesses thinking about this now, and landlords and tenants thinking about this now, because we know it's coming up and we don't want it to be a surprise, and it could be a lot of money. So
Exactly.
thank you for that perspective. It's super helpful. And I wanted to lead off our questions with, we got this submitted a few times, and it was actually something that I had been thinking about for a long time as well. Like how can because a lot of the Made in NYC members are tenants, they're not landlords, right? They don't own their buildings. And their energy usage is tied to equipment that's manufacturing their products. It's not tied so much to lighting, right? Or insulation, et cetera. So there will need to be conversations between landlords and tenants. So I'm wondering if panelists can talk about how can landlords and tenants work together? What's a good way for tenants to come to their landlord to start the conversation now in a way that ensures that like they don't get pressured out of the building, because it's easier for the landlord to just kick tenants out because it'll reduce their energy use like immediately and turn it into a different type of building, right? Like, I don't know if Brian, Fatu could talk about how you've worked with landlords and tenants and like what that looks like, or any suggestions.
Well, it's again, I think it's a partnership, and I don't think that your last comment is probably something that's a reality, because at the bottom line is landlords need tenants, because that's what pays the mortgage, and so
Well, that's
the
good.
notion.
Think that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the way life is. Sometimes we're tied to things that we don't necessarily like because we just have some sort of financial obligation there. It's going to really be I think this is from where we stand now is an education campaign. I don't think that most small businesses, manufacturing businesses, or other businesses for that matter, who are generally, and we all know this because we work with businesses one way or another, usually have their heads down and they're worried about their product, their market, their profit margin, so on and so forth. I don't think most people know about these things. I don't think they know what's coming down the pipe. And I think that we really need to start having conversations. And thank you for having this event today, because this is, maybe a kickoff of that. We need to start having conversations with each other, both tenants and landlords, and talking about responsibilities. I need to make sure that they have energy efficient windows in their unit, but they need to make sure that they have energy efficient motors on their equipment. So again, it's a partnership. We may need, or another landlord may need to pursue a PPA, a power purchase agreement, to put solar on his roof to reduce their electric usage. And that's something that'll benefit the tenant, but the tenant's going to need to, again, to continue along. So I see this as a simultaneous tracks where the landlords and tenants are going to have to work together and be on the same track and be going in the same direction. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult. And I think that all starts with education.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Brian, because it's one of those things where the commercial tenant and landlord relationship has always been this like conundrum in our industry, especially in New York City for quite a long time. But it's not a zero-sum game. It's we all win when we have this communication and understanding of what do we need to do. And as a consultant in the industry, it's one of those things where when tenants, when they're signing up a new lease, there's this thing called the green lease. And I'm still trying to wrap my mind around what does green leases mean? And Brian, by the way, please, if this is something that you guys have used before, I would love to hear.
No, we haven't, but I know we need to do. So this is something that we're all going to have to learn a little bit more about.
Exactly. And I think equally with the green lease, because it focuses on real estate legal attorneys, we are starting to realize that from a carbon emission responsibility perspective with Local Law 97, building owners have to work with environmental lawyers as much as they work with real estate attorneys for leasing, right? For me, it's a beautiful thing because look, the local law 97 legal language is something that I look at it and I read it and I interpret it in my own mind. But from a legal responsibility perspective, you have to consult with an environmental lawyer, and then you have to consult with a real estate attorney. And this is where it's bringing that conversation where everybody needs to make sure that if you own a building and you're responsible for the compliance, because with local law 97, the compliance is on the building owner, not the tenants, except the tenants use all the energy, right? So it's one of those conversations that we're gonna need to go forward with it, and I hope that everybody else who's on the audience today can start thinking about it, because when you sign your lease, you may sign your lease today, or you may have signed your lease like a year ago, 2 months ago, 5 years ago, but you may also care about the environment, and you have to make sure that you hold your landlord accountable, whatever that means to you. You know, I'm not like, proposing anything of any sort, but at the same time, we all have sustainability and environmental initiatives, but there's an economic incentive for landlords and tenants so that we can have this dialogue, and it's open for us to have this conversation. And I'm glad that Made in New York City is having this panel so we can jumpstart this conversation.
Yes, excellent. Thank you. Another question that had come up a couple times, and just as a reminder, there were submissions prior to the event. It was about trying to figure out how you even know if you're in a building that is required. So I didn't know if Alyssa, you could talk about how can a business owner figure out, I mean, they may be they may know the square footage of their space, but what if they don't know the square footage of the building? You know, can you just talk about where people can go to figure this out?
Yeah, definitely. So as I mentioned, buildings over 25,000 square feet are impacted by Local Law 97, and that is specifically also encompassing buildings that have to comply with Local Law 84. And for Local Law 84, each year there is a covered buildings list that's posted on the Department of Buildings website. So a majority of those buildings on that list, there are some caveats in the law about if you have a rent regulated unit that you're not having to comply with the limits of 97, but you have to do prescriptive measures. But in general, buildings over 25,000 square feet and those have had to previously comply with Local Law 84 are the ones that will be having to comply with 97, and that list is publicly available on the Department of Buildings website.
Thank you. Excellent. I want to get to the question that did come in from Hector, who is a local coffee roaster. I'm not sure if the panelists can see this or not. You know, this may be very specific, right, in terms of roasting operations. His question is there information for this type of industrial action in terms of his operations and making them more efficient? I guess in general, right, because there are so many industries within manufacturing, what are resources for businesses that have very specific needs? Like, you know, you could be a fashion manufacturer, furniture maker, you could make anything in the world, right? It's all very different. It uses different equipment. So where do people start to even find information about the specifics of the tools they use in their operations?
Here's what I would say. Because of the nature of all these different industrial businesses, because they eventually occupy a building, right? And they're in a building with multiple other businesses, yeah? And they're leasing from an owner. And when it comes to Local Law 97, the owner is responsible for complying with the law. But it is the tenants who are leasing the space who typically don't really know how much they're using or not using. And we have to begin by encouraging owners and tenants having this conversation. Now, what does that mean? That means that I may, as a company, for example, have to reach out to Bruce Coleman and say, hey, Bruce, you own a building that has 10 different tenants that are in the space that the person who's asking the question that we're trying to answer right now is one of them. And then you may have a tenant who is in a theater industry, and you may have another tenant that is a restaurant, and you may have another tenant that, because the local law 97 determines the carbon emission limit for that whole building based on their different energy use types, right? So, so this is one of those things where when you sign a lease or you're about to sign a lease, we think that we could either get a hold of the landlord or maybe get a hold of the tenant. And if the tenant doesn't even know about it, that's okay. But we want to encourage them to actually reach out to their landlord and say, there's this law, or maybe there's not even this law. I care about climate change. This is what we need to do, right? So it's sort of a hodgepodge of different initiatives. And I'm hoping that going forward, we would be more proactive to being open to having these types of dialogues and just figuring out a way forward.
Thank you. So I realize it is 3:31, and I know some people may hop off. I did want to acknowledge this last question from Daryl. Not sure if there is a couple more minutes. Joanna, I would ask you if it's okay if we answer this, or if we're...
Let's go for it. Let's answer this last question, and then I'll wrap it up.
Okay, great, thank you. So Brian, I'm not sure if you saw this. I think this is directed at you because it says, it's talking about PPAs. But can you talk a little bit more about the PPA? And actually, I would ask this for all the panelists, is, are PPAs a way for a cash-strapped business to comply without having to put money down, right? Like, I know energy efficiency is typically what we want a business to engage in first, but if you can't, and this is a way to reduce your carbon emissions, like, is this an attractive option?
Well, we think it is. I mean, again, a 75 kW solar array could cost several $100,000. It could be $500,000. So great, I own it. I'm responsible for all the maintenance and whatnot, and we'll get great benefit out of it. But first of all, we're a nonprofit, so we don't have the unlimited cash flow that maybe a for-profit developer or owner would. But from us, there's no out-of-pocket expense, zero. The provider of the solar array, the PPA provider, is responsible for all the maintenance and upkeep for a period of 25 or 30 years. And we're purchasing fixed electricity at 50% below today's market. God only knows what will that be, and it's fixed, that number, that 14, 15 cent a kilowatt number that I just gave you is fixed for the period of the term, 25, 30 years. So what is a kilowatt going to cost us in 2042? God only knows, but I'll bet you 14, 15 cents is a third of what a kilowatt might be in 25 years or so. So we haven't discovered a downside. And the other reason is that we're a nonprofit. I will tell you, the only downside that I know of is that there are certain tax benefits, depreciation benefits, and other tax benefits that someone could derive by owning and purchasing their own power purchase agreement. By owning and purchasing their own solar array and not doing a power purchase agreement. So that would be the only known detriment to doing a PPA, in my opinion.
Lisa, do you have anything to say before I jump in? Okay, so here's what I would say. I think that renewables, or whether it's solar or wind, is a solution. But when we're talking about Local Law 97, right, we're always talking about energy efficiency is complex. There's so many different moving parts to it that most people don't want to be bothered by it. But I would just want to say that you don't want to start slapping into on your building all these different, solar solutions without really understanding how is your building actually using energy, right?
Right.
So you've got to figure that out. And by all means, there are incentives that are available out there. You could utilize them. But at the end of the day, you have to look underneath the hood. And part of that process is figuring out whether if you're a manufacturing business and you're leasing a building that belongs to a particular company, you want to know how much are you using, and are you actually paying what reflects of your consumption, right? And just take it from there. It's not the most exciting process to go through, but it's just one of those things where it's a multi-prong approach. It's a multi-prong solution. Figure out what's underneath the hood, implement those, get the best out of it, and then go after solar and go after wind, whatever that may sound like. So.
Thank you. As I like to say, energy efficiency is not as sexy as solar, but it's very, very important. So
that's right.
Thank you, all of you. I'm going to pass it on to Joanna for some final remarks.
Yeah, so thank you, everyone. That was really great, really informative, and really important right now. And I just wanted to thank Rebecca and all the panelists for giving us their time today. I also wanted to give a thank you to Con Ed because we have started this series of webinars during COVID-19 because we needed to be able to get vital information to Maine NYC members around everything from PPP loans to resources for sole proprietors, access to capital for BIPOC manufacturers, and even optimizing your e-commerce. And this is the last webinar in this series, and Con Ed is our sponsor and has very graciously provided us support to be able to put on these webinars during COVID, this virtual time that we're in and continue to be in. So just wanted to give that thank you. I also wanted to let everyone know that Made in NYC has some really exciting things coming up. We are in the midst of planning our annual celebration of New York City's manufacturing community called Made in NYC Week. Our 2020 edition is going to be virtual. It is going to be an online virtual experience, so keep an eye out for our newsletter and on our website as we start to release the full event lineup. We're going to have panel discussions and virtual demos and tastings and a kickoff party and all kinds of great activities that will help you learn more about New York City's manufacturing community and why it is so vital and important. Made in NYC's website is madeinnyc.org, and we have all of our free resources there, all of the free workshops we offer through the Made in NYC Learning Lab, everything that you need to know if you want to buy locally made products. If you are a business on this webinar and not a member yet and want to learn more, please reach out to us. We're here for you. Yeah, and I just hope everyone has a great day. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.